That's the point I'm trying to fucking make. Why are people so dense? Why is this so difficult to comprehend? Yeah, I am being patronizing. I don't know who the f you are, and you're over here. I'm so old. I'm so old. I'm so old, dog. HasanAbi Doctrine, a guide for nation building. Rule 1, get nukes. Rule 2, do not give up the nukes. Rule 3, if you're accused of having nukes, drop everything immediately and find some nukes.
You by Exter.
Overzealots is the #1 dick rider of both Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, which I respect. It's a respectable position. Okay, these are some of the best people that have ever been invented. Okay, Cubans are some of the best people, man. Straight up.
As always, source material will be cited in the corner of the screen throughout the video. Enjoy. In case you were unaware, there exists a small island nation less than 100 miles off the coast of the mainland USA with quite the reputation. A lot is said about this country, and the opinions held about it vary massively. If you listen to those sympathetic to the revolutionary history of Cuba, you'll be told the story of a selfless island nation off the coast of the world's most violent empire that, despite its struggles, which are almost entirely the result of economic warfare waged against it by the United States, gives whatever it can to those in need. Whether that be military assistance to those fighting white supremacists in southern Africa, offering medical aid to others, or even dramatically improving the quality of life domestically relative to the inequality and torture overseen on the island by the previous US-backed dictatorship. But who cares what this guy thinks? I mean, who even is that? These guys are the ones who know what they're talking about.
Cuba is the epicenter, is the headquarters of evil in the Western Hemisphere.
Socialist dictator who murdered all dissidents.
What could you possibly say that's positive about a man like Fidel Castro?
We are sitting in a dangerous predicament.
He actually created a giant gulag and sentenced everybody in the country to stay in it.
Wait, what? No, within just 2 years of the revolution, 200,000 Cubans emigrated, and over 500,000 left during its first decade. And Cuba went on to experience levels of immigration comparable to those of its neighboring countries in the late 20th century. While Cubans did need exit paperwork, and this process was often a bureaucratic mess, one of the main bottlenecks was often the receiving country, especially the US, which restricted legal visas while rewarding undocumented arrivals, seemingly encouraging the kind of dramatic spectacles that could be used for propaganda. And Fidel Castro himself declared the revolution strictly voluntary, and he even facilitated periodic mass exoduses, later agreeing to a US proposed airlift when dangerous sea departures became common. God damn it, Ben, you make it so hard for me to make a funny little montage when I have to pause and refute your bullshit. It's such a buzzkill.
We are on the edge of war and have been for some time.
He exiled all religious figures.
No, he didn't.
100 years from now, historians are going to look at Fidel Castro and say, this guy was a...
Yeah, isn't Cuba to America historically like Taiwan is to China? Always heard the history went really deep. No, what the fuck? No, Cuba is comprised entirely of Spanish and African migrants and slave labor initially. The fuck? Cuba was never a part of the United States of America. United States of America basically was a colonial occupant, and the indigenous population as well, which is ironically often forgotten.
To supersede Lenin and Stalin.
Under Batista, Cuba was one of the richest countries in Latin America.
Gross.
Fidel was a genius at evil, and right now they're ending those. Their days are numbered.
Che Guevara said, there's a direct quote from Che, this piece of crap who you see people walking around with his face on t-shirts. It's like walking around again with a Stalin t-shirt. So to send men to the firing squad, judicial proof is unnecessary, is what Che Guevara said. These procedures are an archaic bourgeois detail. This is a revolution. And a revolutionary must become a cold killing machine motivated by pure hate. We must create a pedagogy of the paradigm. That's the execution law.
This is a fabrication. Che never said this. It's attributed to Che, but in reality, it's the result of splicing together a bunch of random shit to form a blurb he never said nor wrote. In fact, this Frankenstein of a quote is contradicted by the historical record and does not represent Che's actions.
Yo, if you want to learn what Cuba is actually like, look at declassified CIA materials. Okay? Not the shit that the CIA was putting out as propaganda to the public. And not the, activated American Cubans, right? The Miami lobby. But just look at what they were openly saying behind closed doors. A lot of this information is already declassified, so it's very easy to find out on your own. That's all you need to do. They straight up in their analysis at the time in the Cuban Revolution were openly admitting that, one, the revolution did not have a socialist characteristic, even though it was an agrarian revolution, a national revolution, a social revolution, right? Having said that, initially they were like, there is not enough evidence here that Fidel Castro is a communist or a socialist at all. That came after, but it doesn't matter. Che Guevara always was a socialist. But not only that, but also they very openly looked at some of the punishments that came after the successful revolution. And the CIA said that in comparison to the mass executions and torture regime implemented by Batista, that the Cuban Revolution was shockingly bloodless, okay? Shockingly bloodless. So, like, whatever they were saying in their materials, okay, of propaganda was unironically the exact opposite of what they were saying behind closed doors.
For example, he never said judicial proof is unnecessary. In reality, he explicitly warned his judges to be scrupulous about weighing the evidence in each case so as not to give the revolution's enemies additional ammunition, wrote the foremost biographer on Guevara, John Lee Anderson. And the judge who gathered evidence and sat on the appellate bench with Che stated that, "We gave each case due and fair consideration, and we didn't come to our decisions lightly." So again, Ben is lying. There is no primary source to substantiate the claim that this quote was said or written by Che. It doesn't exist, and Che's actions contradict it. Are you going to let me do my montage now, dude?
Che Guevara, worse than Castro, obviously wasn't an official dictator, but what he wanted. Picture Adolf Hitler, who's bad, without the, some would call it, charm.
He asked the Soviet Union to actually nuke the United States.
Che Guevara was less charming than Adolf Hitler.
Mass murdering dictator.
For all of my criticisms of Adolf Hitler, he was punctual.
Summary executions, again, tens of thousands of people murdered.
We're Cuban Americans from Miami.
But in all seriousness, if you live in the West, odds are you've been raised to think the worst about Cuba. From stories of an evil dictator, Fidel Castro.
Not really. You know, what's really remarkable about this also is that, one, during the Cuban Revolution, Americans had a 50-50 split on it, especially a lot of black Americans were very fond of the Cuban Revolution. That's number one. And number two, when we say the West, we often think of just the United States of America. For the United States of America, that is the case, right? Tremendous amounts of propaganda about Cuba. But for the rest of the world, the United Nations has been demanding the end of this unjustifiable embargo for quite a while, for multiple decades. And not only that, but also the rest of the world has normal relations with Cuba. They just have to constantly dance around American embargoes. That's it. America is actually the odd man out here in comparison to the rest of the world. Like, countries have normal diplomatic relations with Cuba. Countries try to engage in commerce to the best of their ability beyond secondary sanctions in Cuba. You know, Free Press put out a hit piece on you. Yeah, once again, it's very strange. It's all Israel. It is like, I mean, this is obviously an Israeli outlet, as you guys know. This is an outlet that's like a Zionist outlet. It's very strange that America seemingly has outsourced its entire intelligence community to the beautiful nation state, the most moral nation of Israel. Very interesting.
Seizing power against the wishes of the population, then stealing everything for himself and plunging what was once a rich and prosperous country into ruin, to tales about the supposedly racist and homophobic revolutionary doctor Che Guevara, who apparently gave up on his Hippocratic oath and decided to Michael Myers his way across the island for no good reason.
Did you know that Che Guevara, was he the Cuban guy?
Well,
Or was that Castro?
Castro was Cuban. Che, he was part of the Cuban Revolution. He wasn't Cuban himself.
Yeah, Che, the revolutionary, he once executed a 12-year-old for being too anti-revolutionary. Shot him in the face, bro.
Yeah, no, he didn't.
Wow. Yeah, I heard it was a 10-year-old.
do that. This is what happens when you get all of your news.
This seems coordinated. Yeah, no, for sure. For sure. Steven Crowder, Ben Shapiro, Free Press, every single Hasbara outlet, every single one. Very strange.
From either Reddit or ChatGPT. You've surely heard about the poverty and the economic hardships in Cuba, which are supposedly solely the result of godless communist economics and not the blockade levied against Cuba by the United States, one that has been nearly unanimously condemned by the United Nations, with the predictable, consistent exceptions of the Yankees and Israel, though that list has grown in recent years to include other loyal dogs of US imperialism like Javier Milei's Argentina. The point I'm trying to make here is not that Cuba is some perfect paradise. It isn't. It's far from it, and people are suffering. It's true that I myself fall into the camp of Cuba sympathizers, but my goal with this video isn't to sell you the idea that Cuba is a utopia. It's to fill you in on an alternative perspective that gets relentlessly demonized in the West, to maybe challenge some of your preconceptions about the
Not every critical left voice is CIA. That maybe they shouldn't be doing the work for free.
Island, and to show you how the real history of Cuba is one of anti-colonial struggle against the world's most brutal empires, and then decades of punishment for successfully throwing off the yoke of imperialism. If I can't get you to change your mind about the country, at the very least, this video will exist to show you who exactly you've been told to despise. You can decide for yourself whether the aggression toward Cuba is warranted, whether it deserves the designation in the United States as a so-called state sponsor of terrorism, or whether the country's economic issues are the result of economic illiteracy or a cruel and frankly genocidal blockade. In the spirit of full transparency, this video will start with the Spanish colonization of Cuba, then move into the period when the United States took over the exploitation, before getting into Fidel Castro's revolution and the relentless sabotage waged against the country by the US. Along the way, I'll be refuting the usual anti-Cuba tropes as they come up. Before we get started, I want to take a minute to thank today's sponsor, Exter. We talk a lot until April 13th with up to 45% off. And if you use the promo code Overzealots, you'll get an extra 20% off for a limited time. Click the link below and shop with confidence knowing that Exter offers a 100-day money-back guarantee. Now let's get back to the video.
What is bro's accent? He's Canadian,
the
if you
infamous
couldn't
colonizer,
tell.
Christopher Columbus, came in contact with and reported on the existence of a beautiful island we now know as Cuba. It wasn't actually Columbus who launched the conquest of Cuba, and
If I'm not mistaken, I think Overzealots used to be a left com, and it's his unlimited admiration for the Cuban Revolution that might have actually turned him into a communist instead. I feel like he's talked about it, right? Like he used to be a left com, but then he like loved Che Guevara and Fidel Castro so much
it wouldn't be for another 19 years
that it turned
until
him
somebody
into
did. And that someone was
maybe
a
a
Spanish
libertarian
conquistador
socialist?
by the name of Diego de Velázquez, who invaded and started the Spanish colonization of the island in 1511. Prior to his conquest, Cuba was inhabited by multiple groups indigenous to the Americas. The earliest to arrive on the island were the Guanahatabes, migrants from the forests of northern South America who lived hunter-gatherer lifestyles.
Okay, bro. I mean, this is correct. This is I'm glad that he's going through all this. This is literally the same book that I'm reading currently, by the way, that let's see if he continues with some of the things that I recognize, but I'm sure he's read many books on Cuba because he like loves Cuba, but this is literally
the Taino made up the majority of the population by the time of contact with the Spanish, were skilled agriculturalists and very hospitable, according to Spanish accounts. They cultivated yucca root, which they baked into cassava bread, grew cotton, tobacco, and lived in houses known as bohíos, structures designed so efficiently that Spanish settlers were quick to copy them, and which remain a feature of Cuban architecture today. In fact, the very name Cuba comes from the Taino language. Now, the reason I'm telling you all of this is to weed out the presumptions that many Westerners hold about indigenous societies. And
the book that I'm reading, that there a lot of the information that he's talking about, which is like just a historic account, but summarizes it with like very similar languages. Cuba: A New History by Richard Gott. I think it's Richard Gott. Yeah, Richard Gott. Oh, he did. He put the source in the bottom. I didn't. Oh, yeah, it is. Yeah, Cuba: A New History, Richard Gott, Chapter 1. Yeah.
The arrogance of the colonizer is such that replacing a rich indigenous culture with a system of colonial looting and slavery is somehow branded as an improvement, and in some cases, portrayed as a great favor done to the colonized peoples. But that isn't true. In Cuba's case, the immense suffering inflicted on the island
It's a really
stands as
good book
direct
and very readable. Very, very readable. I highly recommend it.
testament to the ills of colonialism and the post-colonial legacy it left behind. Once the Spanish took over the island, they enacted the encomienda system. As historian Greg Grandin explains in his book America, America, the encomienda system in the context of the Americas refers to a kind of slavery, but indios encomendados,
Overzealots is so
commended
fucking
Indians,
good.
weren't considered private property or chattel. Rather, they were formerly something like wards, members of an existing village or community who, in exchange for labor, were to receive instruction in Christian doctrine from their overlords, their guardian encomenderos. The encomienda was important.
No, there are leftists from inside the country now, who we should honestly contend with the socialist Cuba, the oligarch sincerity, and the humanitarian flotilla in El País. I saw, dude. Yes, Carlos Manuel Alvarez, who's an exiled Marxist from Cuba. We can engage his perspectives actually living in Cuba, or else it's a cult. How offensive to say any critical voices doing the CIA's work. It is true. It is true. You can have reasonable critique against the Cuban government. Okay. I mean, I literally fucking taught. Okay, I'm going to reveal it now. But one of the things that I said to the foreign vice minister was literally to ask why Cuba was so resistant to implementing some sort of economic reforms, like the opening up of the economy, like Deng Xiaoping did, okay? And I'm not the first person who has probably asked him that question. And I'm sure there are plenty. I mean, I talked to Cubans. Like, you're making it seem like I arrived at the conclusion I arrived at without, like, talking to any fucking Cubans about their day-to-day existence. I've also openly explained to you that there are plenty of young Cubans, especially, that have completely checked out of participating in the political, the political structure as a consequence of, as a direct consequence of feeling of helplessness, that genuinely think, for example, that the government is lying about the blockade and simply using the blockade as a fucking response mechanism for their own personal failures. Was it him? Yes, I did.
Countries.
Yeah, this is him. Yes, Cuban Deputy Foreign Minister, Vice Foreign Minister Cosio, Carlos Fernandez de Cosio. Very smart guy. Wow, what a great trade. One gives you labor and the other indoctrinates you, Lamau. What? Fair question, but I think the embargo cooked that. I mean, ironically enough, that's precisely what he said as well, that they are open for, they're open to reforms and have reformed since 2019 especially, okay? But the you're responding to the video, the encomienda system.
But it was just one of many coerced labor systems. As the indigenous workforce began to deplete due to mistreatment and disease, the Spanish, starting in the 1520s, began bringing over African slaves in large numbers to fill their roles. By the late 1700s, in response to the sugar boom, huge waves of enslaved Africans were brought to Cuba to work on sugar plantations. This sharpened the class contradictions, exacerbated racial stratification, and solidified Cuba as a racial slave state. For those who may be unfamiliar, the Spanish imposed brutal racial hierarchies in their colonies. In Cuba, it looked roughly like this. Peninsulars, white Spaniards born in Spain, were at the top. Below them were Creoles, the descendants of Spanish colonizers born in the Americas. And beneath them were indigenous and African peoples, with free people of color, which Cuba had a relatively large number of, placed above enslaved Africans. While the Spanish originally envisioned their colonies as a binary system of two legally distinct republics, the Republic of Spaniards and the Republic of Indians, as they referred to it. This framework fell apart fairly quickly, especially in Cuba's case, where largely due to the massive decline of the indigenous population, the mass importation of enslaved Africans, and mixing between all these groups, it devolved into a weird and gross caste system based on blood and lineage, where proximity to blackness placed you lower in the social order. By the mid to late 1800s, the Creoles, the descendants of the Spanish born in Cuba, started to sharpen their nationalist movements and aimed to fight off the Spanish-born peninsulars, who had monopolized power. Much of this movement was largely concerned with maintaining the existing social order, but just swapping the peninsulars at the top with the Creoles, the Cuban-born elites. Even when the 10 Years' War for Independence began in 1868, led by plantation owners who wanted to boot out the Spanish, the movement was conflicted over issues like slavery and maintaining the existing social order. There was, however, a Creole by the name of José Martí who despised the racial stratification and sought to unite Cubans of all races in one national liberatory struggle for independence. Martí formed the Cuban
The problem is, Hasan, that the Cuban government has done both. Yes, they are were for a very long time resistance to any sort of economic reform or change, even when it meant that the struggle was elevated. However, you cannot look at that outside of the context of an ongoing blockade that persists to this day and has gotten only worse as time has gone on. Because in the absence of said unjustifiable blockade, who knows how Cuba would have fucking developed? Okay? That's the point. These guys have never had a moment of relief. It was always siege warfare. Okay? You will understand, hopefully, how much the American engineering, has played a formative role in every aspect of Cuban existence in very invisible ways. That was my fucking goal, was to investigate the deep and meaningful ways in which Cuba, not dissimilar to Israel, by the way, and its design for Palestinian society, has been able to control and limit every aspect of existence in this sovereign state.
Revolutionary Party in 1892 with the goal to unite the fractured independence movements in the country, and by 1895, the final war for Cuban independence from the Spanish began. In just 3 years, the rebels, whom Martí was no longer a part of...
How long has this been on for? Since the successful revolution in Cuba. It started instantly and never ended, and has only gotten worse in the last couple of years. In 2019, the secondary sanctions on oil started seriously harming oil trade coming into Cuba. But as far as like the worst version of a full-blown total blockade of oil into the island, that's like a couple months. If you're asking about the video, it's been 12 minutes.
As he died early in battle, had so badly beaten the Spanish that they were on the verge of collapse. Cuban independence was closer than ever, but the rebels failed to consider one very important thing: the audacity of the United States. See, the US had long coveted the island and wanted to take it over from the Spanish. You can see figures as old as Thomas Jefferson and John Quincy Adams fantasizing about this. The US is also notorious for playing dirty, and its meddling in 1898 stripped the hard-earned victory away from the Cuban rebels. As Grandin recounts the story, white and black Cubans fought side by side, with free people of color and former slaves obtaining the highest military ranks. Black officers commanded ordinary soldiers of lighter skin, marching through the Cuban countryside, taking over plantations, setting cane fields ablaze, and occupying villages and cities. In the years after Martí's death, Spain's army had fallen back, disordered and demoralized. There was little doubt that the insurgents would win. Then, on February 15, 1898, the gunpowder magazines on board the USS Maine exploded, killing most of its crew and sinking the ship, which had been anchored in Havana's harbor. President William McKinley used the explosion, which he blamed on Spain.
It's not the last time. It's not the last time America pulled this off, okay? They did this again after the revolution as well.
It's a pretext to enter the war, dispatching the U.S. Navy to Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and Cuba. United States troops easily took Spain's island colonies and, in Cuba, shunted aside the rebel army. A new government, supervised by a military staff that included ex-Confederates like Fitzhugh Lee, Robert E. Lee's nephew, imposed a system of racial segregation roughly based on the model of the post-Reconstruction South. Washington kept Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, but granted nominal independence to Cuba. The United States did insist that the new republic include in its constitution a clause called the Platt Amendment after Connecticut Senator Orville Platt that granted the United States the right to intervene in the nation.
Remember that. The Platt Amendment is the reason why the Cuban Republic by the revolutionaries is considered a pseudo-republic. Okay? Because how can you have true sovereignty if there is a literal fucking amendment? A constitutional carve-out for American military intervention. This is why I'm saying, like, this started in the 1900s, like literally 1901 is when the Cuban Republic was established. It was a pseudo-republic. It was not truly sovereign. And over again, American military intervention, whenever like people were rising up, whenever there were racial tensions in the island, because remember, the island is also was very racist, very white supremacist, as I've talked about extensively. Like there was a racial dynamic, but instead of having 13% of the population be black, imagine if 50% of the population is black, with the white upper caste actively trying to bring in more and more Spanish white people with the express purpose of keeping the majority of the island white.
Affairs at will. So, to summarize, the Cuban War for Independence from Spain was fought by Cuban rebels of all different backgrounds, united by a shared goal of long overdue liberation and equality. They did all the heavy lifting and brought the Spanish to the brink of collapse. The US then used an explosion on one of its ships as a pretext to declare war on Spain, took over Cuba and occupied it until 1902, sidelined and disbanded the multiracial independence army, who again did all the work, imposed some white supremacists who installed another system of racial segregation, and added a constitutional amendment stipulating that the US could intervene in Cuba however the fuck it wants at any time. Nice. So at this point, the Spanish are out, and the new Cuban Constitution of 1901 gives the Yankees the ability to militarily intervene in Cuba whenever they want, control Cuba's foreign and economic policies, and seize land for US naval bases. This neo-colonial control over Cuba allowed for US corporate interests to get extremely rich at the expense of the vast majority of the island's inhabitants. As Aviva Chomsky puts it in her book on the matter, Cuban politics remained hostage to the United States, while US companies and investors took control of the major sectors of Cuba's economy. By 1905, 60% of Cuba's rural land was owned by US citizens or companies. US investors also controlled 90% of Cuba's tobacco trade, the country's iron, copper, and nickel mines, its railroads, and its electricity and telephone systems. And
once again, you do not steal from a poor man. You steal from the rich. To bring up a famous Parenti quote when he talks about Africa, but Cuba is not a poor country. Cuba's a rich country. It's just been overexploited and stolen from over and over again.
Things only got worse from there. She goes on to elucidate the state of Cuba on the eve of the revolution that brought Castro's government to power. One could say that there were at least two Cubas in the 1950s. One was the 1.5 million who were jobless or who belonged to the rural poor, including landless workers and campesinos with small plots. These impoverished Cubans survived mostly on rice, a few beans, and sugar water, creating the naked children, their swollen stomachs testifying to an unbalanced diet and infection from parasitic worms that sociologist Lori Nelson found everywhere in rural Cuba in 1950. At the other end of the spectrum, the 900,000 or so wealthiest Cubans controlled 43% of the country's income. These were the people who had money to spend on frequent shopping jaunts to Miami Miami. Luxurious air-conditioned homes and even mausoleums complete with elevators, air conditioners, and telephones to make sure they continued to enjoy a high level of comfort in the afterlife. In between, another 3.5 million struggled to make ends meet. What was it that this little guy was saying again?
Under Bautista, Cuba was one of the richest countries in Latin America. It was on the upswing.
All right, dude, sure. Cuba's close integration with the U.S. economy meant that almost everything Cubans bought was imported from the United States, and the cost of living was as high or higher than in the United States. But Cuban wages were much lower, and Cubans had none of the social services and guarantees that U.S. citizens enjoyed. Cuba was forced into an all-too-familiar position of dependency, where it would export its raw materials just to import manufactured goods from the imperial core that cost more than it made through.
To be fair, this system didn't really change that much either, unfortunately.
Its resources were coveted and appropriated by the U.S. Vast tracts of Cuban land were held in reserve by American companies, leaving them idle while Cubans remained landless and hungry. Now, in order for the U.S. to maintain this dynamic of subjugating...
This is literally Puerto Rico right now? Yes, that's why I say the closest analog to what America wants out of Cuba is territorializing it in the same vein as Puerto Rico.
Majority of the Cuban population for the benefit of a slim portion of Cuban elites and U.S. companies, it installed a comprador government in Cuba to remain friendly to U.S. interests. That's where this man, Fulgencio Batista, comes into the story. A little context. In 1933, a nationalist government came into power in Cuba, and among other progressive things, it abrogated the Platt Amendment. Remember that thing that gave the U.S. the ability to do whatever it wanted with Cuba? Well, this was unacceptable to the Americans, who were disgusted at the thought of Cubans manufacturing their own destiny, so U.S. officials began conspiring with the Cuban military officer by the name of Batista. U.S. Ambassador Sumner Welles privately cultivated Batista, suggesting to him that the very great majority of the commercial and financial interests in Cuba who are looking for protection could only find such protection in himself, and that the United States would look approvingly on an overthrow of the revolutionary government. Batista took him up on that offer. He forced the sitting Cuban president to resign, replaced him with a conservative, and in January of 1934, with U.S. support, he began ruling Cuba from behind the scenes as the Army Chief of Staff.
Dumb criticism. People like Hasan the Hun are in Cuba on holiday. They're in Cuba because the U.S. blockade is intensified and strangling the island. They're making sure the island is on the minds of Americans because as soon as Trump is done with Iran, he's turning to Cuba. Yep. I've written thousands of words criticizing the type of administrative central planning that was featured in Cuba after the revolution. Also, Boshkar. Fucking lib. Anyway, I think there were developmental mistakes that combined with the U.S. embargo and were only partially offset by Soviet subsidies in the first decades of the revolution. A time that still saw dignity, self-determination, great strides in fields like education and healthcare, and incredible international triumphs abroad. For years, though, Cuba has pursued the Sino-Vietnamese reform road and made many of the right economic decisions. This is also true. Yet, besides for the brief Obama opening, the U.S. has responded by escalating its economic warfare against Cuba. Even before the recent fuel blockade, Washington has tried to prevent Cuba from trading in even exempted items. Even banks not headquartered in the U.S. feared processing state-owned companies, payments to international suppliers, much less financing development efforts. That's not just an embargo or one country refusing to trade with another. That's economic terrorism. It's imperialism in a negative form, and it's great to see so many people travel to Cuba to continue to expose it and its impact. It's 100% correct. He nails the landing there. He sticks the landing. Yeah, the Sino Road being notoriously awful. Dude, I don't give a fuck, okay? Call me a dingus if you want, but yes, black cat, white cat, as long as it catches a rat, who cares? The problem is that the reforms are negligible when the island is being is being placed under this like brutal form of economic terrorism, collective punishment, a war crime. It also, just like the Iranian negotiations, were not about like denuclearizing Iran, as we've seen over and over again, right? The American intervention in Cuba has nothing to do with like forcing the country to open up. It's bullshit. It's complete fucking bullshit. It's utter nonsense.
Propping up various civilian presidents to serve as his face. As Aviva Chomsky summarized, directly or behind the scenes, Batista would remain a power maker until 1959. From 1934 to 44 and 1952 to 59, Batista was the ultimate authority in Cuba. And that latter reign of his, the one that started in 1952, saw him return to power by force in a coup and establish a brutal US-backed dictatorship, sparking the Cuban Revolution. This is a CIA document comparing the brutality of Fulgencio Batista's regime with the rule of Fidel Castro. It goes on to point out that tens of thousands of individuals were murdered by Batista's regime, that his forces had killed on a whim, and that the anti-Batista forces in the country had the support of up to 90% of the population by 1958. And crucially, it goes on to write that the large-scale campaigns of murders and terrorism characteristic of the last years of the Batista regime have not occurred during the Castro regime. Even JFK commented in a 1960 speech, Fulgencio Batista murdered 20,000 Cubans in 7 years, a greater proportion of the Cuban population than the proportion of Americans who died in both world wars. The reason I tell you this is to challenge the narrative that many of us are fed about the Cuban Revolution and to show that the vast majority of the population supported Che, Castro, and the rebels, and that the true bloodthirsty tyrant in Cuba was the guy that the Americans propped up. I mean, Batista's ruthless secret police force, the Bureau for the Repression of Communist Activities, was straight up funded and advised by the CIA. To quickly remind you before we go any further, the state of Cuba prior to the revolution was one where the US had essentially transformed it into a playpen for American companies and elites to get rich at the direct expense of the majority of Cubans who were exploited by this setup. As the renowned journalist John Lee Anderson wrote, by the mid-1950s, Cuba was earning a reputation where weekend Americans came to gamble, drink, and carouse with Havana's many prostitutes. A notorious character named Schwartzman ran a theater featuring hardcore blue films and live sex performances, and the American crime syndicates were moving in as well, opening nightclubs and gambling casinos, all at a time where the majority of Cubans were suffering immensely. Now, this segment of the video is not going to be me portraying Cuba as some sort of utopia and acting like everything was smooth sailing the second the rebels took over. It's going to be an honest assessment of Cuba's conditions pre-revolution and how they improved in the years that followed. But first, let's rewind a bit and tell the story of how the revolution came to be. In the wake of Batista's 1952 coup and the subsequent US recognition of his government, a new generation of young activists became directly radicalized. They saw not only their hopes of democracy crushed, but also the US support and co-sign of Batista's tyrannical rule, prioritizing its anti-communist obsession over the well-being of Cubans. One of the individuals radicalized during this time was a young lawyer by the name of Fidel Castro, who, tired of operating strictly through legal means in the face of a dictator who couldn't care less about rules and laws, began embracing armed struggle as a way to achieve liberation. Forgive me if I'm jumping forward a bit here, but it's worth noting that Fidel Castro was not originally a communist or even all too hostile to the US. He was an economic nationalist who didn't want to see Cuba ripped off and exploited. This was fully understood by US officials who noted that Castro was appointing relatively conservative and even anti-communist figures to his government once he assumed power, but I'm getting ahead of myself. On July 26, 1953, so just a year after Batista came to power in a coup, Castro led roughly 160 rebels in an attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba, hoping to ignite a mass popular uprising. Militarily, it was a mess. The revolt failed, and many of the rebels were captured, tortured, and executed. Fidel and his brother Raul were imprisoned, but Fidel used the trial as a platform. He delivered his now famous "History Will Absolve Me" speech, and he went on to lay out a political platform that would later become the basis of the revolution. He laid out the 5 revolutionary laws that the Moncada attackers intended to implement: restoration and implementation of the 1940 Constitution, an agrarian reform putting land in the hand of those who tilled it, obligation of employers to share profits with workers, guaranteed markets for small sugar farmers, and confiscation of all enterprises obtained through fraud and corruption. All of these revolutionary laws, he emphasized, were based on the Constitution itself, which restricted large land holdings and provided labor rights, wrote Chomsky. Following a public amnesty campaign, Fidel and his brother were released in May 1955 and formally founded the July 26th movement, named in commemoration of their 1953 Moncada attack. They then went into exile in Mexico to regroup and reorganize, where they met new revolutionaries, including the legendary Ernesto Che Guevara, and began solidifying the movement. In November of 1956, 82 rebels crowded onto the yacht Granma and sailed for Cuba. Disaster greeted the landing. Delayed, ambushed, and nearly wiped out, a small handful of survivors managed to retreat into the Sierra Maestra mountain range in southeastern Cuba. From there,
this is very similar to Mao's fucking Long March. It's they overcome great odds, and they basically are able to make they're basically able to convince the locals. Yeah, from 82 to 13. By the way, they get stuck in the fucking swamps. Straight up generate a popular revolution.
Revolution expanded on two fronts, the Sierra and the Llano. The Sierra referred to the war waged by mountain guerrilla fighters, while the Llano referred to the struggle in the cities, where an urban underground initiated strikes, carried out sabotage, and engaged in armed resistance against the regime. As the rebels waged war from
This is also why I always say this kind of stuff is multifaceted. You can't have like a singular mindset. Okay? It's just not. It's conducted on every front.
Sierra Maestra, they began to gain the trust of the peasantry, who had been horrifically neglected by the Batista regime and suffered from diseases, poverty, illiteracy, and landlessness. The rebels, by treating these people with respect, treating them medically, and even teaching them to read, created a vital and expansive network for intelligence and new recruits. In April of 1958, the revolutionary movement engaged in a general strike with the hopes that it would topple the dictator, but it failed. This failure actually emboldened Batista and gave him the confidence to launch a massive offensive in the hopes that he could finally crush the insurgency. He sent 10,000 troops with tanks and...
I don't think the July 26th movement could have won without the urban and rural support. Absolutely.
Air support after the rebels in the Sierra Maestra.
America didn't have a revolution, chat? No, it did. They just had a bourgeois revolution, like the French Revolution, right? Like there are still revolutions. They're, but they take on different forms. The Cuban Revolution was objectively a proletarian revolution. That's the reason. That's the main difference, right? Bourgeois revolutions have been taught in school as the acceptable forms of revolution over and over again, while the proletarian revolutions have always been looked at with tremendous scrutiny.
Amazingly, despite being hugely outnumbered and utilizing inferior...
My boomer dad has been confused in Avengers Endgame. How am I supposed to explain this to him?
Weaponry, the rebels, due to their discipline and familiarity with the terrain, defeated Batista's army. The Battle of El Gig in July of 1958 saw an entire army battalion surrender to the rebels and marked the end of Batista's offensive. In late 1958, rebel forces, led by Che Guevara, seized Santa Clara and smashed what was left of the regime. Batista fled on January 1st, 1959, as the rebels entered Havana to enormous popular support, marking a complete triumph of the revolution. As Aviva Chomsky writes in regards to the popularity of the revolution, the Cuban population was overwhelmingly supportive of the new government and its reforms. The only opposition came from close supporters of Batista and members of his military, and property holders whose properties were threatened. As U.S. opposition to Castro cemented, his popularity in Cuba remained strong. U.S. policymakers needed to consider the continued emotional attachment to Fidel Castro as a national symbol by the bulk of the Cuban people, as well as the continued belief by virtually all Cubans in the need for social and economic changes embodied to date only in Castro's revolutionary program.
Fidel Castro ruled his people through what? Through fear.
Did your friend from Miami tell you that?
1 million machete-wielding peasants jammed the square before Cuba's national capital in response to the call of Fidel Castro for a celebration of the 6th anniversary of his 26th of July revolutionary movement. It is perhaps the greatest mass rally ever staged in the Western Hemisphere, a telling demonstration of Castro's sway over the Cuban masses.
Fidel Castro ruled his people through what? Through fear.
With all that said, the story of the Cuban...
It's the funniest thing to say about Fidel Castro, like straight up.
Revolution is one of united struggle against a tyrannical despot. Guerrilla fighters stationed themselves in the mountains, cared for the peasantry by treating them with dignity, teaching them to read and fight, providing medical aid, and awakening class consciousness, while agents in the cities carried out strikes and sabotage in a coordinated effort to topple the regime. It's a story of solidarity, revolutionary struggle, and liberation. The kind of shit you'd expect Americans to find cool given their own history and romanticization of their revolution. In fact, The Cuban one was way cooler. It was rooted in social reforms, alleviating extreme poverty, and fighting imperialism. The Americans, by contrast, fought the British so that they could keep genociding the natives to the west of the original 13 colonies, but that's another story, and a crude oversimplification, I'll admit. But the point is, when the topic turns to Cuba, those in the upper echelons of Western society refuse to show it any grace or charity, even though its history is one of colonialism, whether Spanish or the US neocolonialism that followed, and revolutionary struggle for liberation. We've grown so accustomed to pointing at Cuba and mocking it for its relative poverty for political points that we fail to see that we're laughing at the way it survives while our countries strangle it, to paraphrase that Castro quote. So for this segment, I'll dedicate some time to highlighting all that Cuba has achieved and all the selflessness it shows to countries in need. I know things are looking...
That's why I said Cuba's been there for every other country. So now it is our time to be there for Cuba.